My name is Sam Gosling. I'm a professor of psychology at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm interested in the connection between people and the spaces in which they live and dwell. I'm interested in particular in personality and how that connects to people and places. So for example, how do people leave traces of their personalities in the spaces they occupy, and how do spaces affect people? My early work looked at residential spaces and places where people work, but I'm now particularly interested in how people don't just manipulate spaces, but they move around to try to affect spaces. So for example, if they want to feel a certain way, they decide to go to, say, a certain kind of cafe, or they decide to go to a certain room in the house to try to affect their emotions. And I think this is a tremendously important area of research because I think it's a very pervasive way in which people affect their thoughts and feelings. Yet, if you look at the emotion literature, virtually nobody has studied this. Lots of people are studying how people affect their own emotions and what they do to try to change them. But if you look in the literature, you'll see virtually no mention of space as a way to do that. Yet I think it's probably one of the most pervasive ways in which people do affect their emotions. So I talk about three broad types of ways people express themselves. The first is these deliberate statements that people make about themselves, the things they want to tell others, and I call these identity claims. Now, perhaps one difference between what I'm talking about and what Geoffrey Miller is talking about is that people may want to make an identity claim that is counter to being a high prestige claim. People may want to make a counter-prestigious claim. They may be, if you're, say, somebody who wants, like here we are right now, rowing down the canal in Berlin. The people on the sides of this canal, I don't think they want to buy a Mercedes or a Porsche if they could. That's not what they see as the valuable identity they want to convey. So I think identity claims are very important and show some links perhaps with Miller's category, but also some important differences. And I think one thing to remember here is that identity claims, although they're deliberate, many people think that just because they're deliberate claims, that means they are people being manipulative or disingenuous. But I think in most cases that's not the case. There's lots of research in psychology. I'm thinking of, for example, Bill Swan's work on self-verification that shows that most of the time people want to be known. They want others to see them as they see themselves. They're not just trying to create a good impression. The second category that we talk about in our research is thought and feeling regulators. That is, many of the things we put in our space are things we put there deliberately, so they're like identity claims in that sense, but they're not there for the benefit of others. They're there to make us think about things or feel a certain way. Great examples are maybe the mementos you have in front of your desk. They're not there for others to see. They're there to remind you of maybe a happy time, a person or a place or something like that. And then the third category is what I call behavioral residue. And this is the inadvertent traces of our behaviors. When we're in our spaces, we engage in many behaviors, and a subset of those behaviors leave a trace in the environment. And so this is more like the sort of thing that perhaps Sherlock Holmes would be looking for. You can look for clues to find out the traces of everyday behavior. And these clues build up over time, which is why they serve as quite reliable estimates of people's behavior, which of course is the link to personality. There's been a lot of research recently looking at virtual spaces, and by virtual spaces it could be things like one's social media profile, or even things like one's Second Life world, or even one's character in online games like World of Warcraft. And I think there are some similarities between those and some important differences too. The similarities are that it's really people engaging in authentic social interactions. So you see traces of those interactions in some ways it offers great advantages. Many social interactions in the offline world don't leave a trace. So if you and I have a conversation with each other, we have that conversation, it's ephemeral and it just vanishes. Whereas if people have a conversation in, say, a social media platform like Facebook or on email or Twitter or something like that, it leaves a trace, that we can analyze pretty well. So in some ways, social media and virtual worlds offer many more clues to behavior. Another way they offer many more is that they're not limited. So in something like World of Warcraft, for example,
yes,
you can be what you want. You can be who you want to be, you can fly, you can do all kinds of things. You're not limited by the constraints of the physical world or your constraints. Of course, that also allows people to kind of diverge more from who they are. And in fact, World of Warcraft is the one area where we've found that people, if you make an impression of somebody based on their World of Warcraft avatar, that's the one place we've found that people do not judge others accurately on the basis of those avatars. They agree what that person's like, but they're not right. And the reason that we're interested in personality is because, presumably, it gives us some insight into how people will behave. So if we can use many of these forms of technology to find out directly how people will behave, where they go, what they like to do, their behavioral habits and so on, that does, in some sense, remove the need for personality assessment. Personality has a long history of looking at things like social outcomes, health outcomes, and entrepreneurial outcomes. So, for example, some of our work in geographic analyses of personality shows these connections too. So what we've done in this study, and it's in collaboration with Jason Renfro, mosquito, at Cambridge University, he and I have been looking at the average personalities of different regions. And what we find is that even after you control for standard socioeconomic factors like class, race, education, etc., we find that the people in the personality of a state, so by a personality of a state, I mean the average level of, say, openness or agreeableness, the big 5 traits and so on, the average level of people in that state is correlated with other indicators in that state. So, for example, we find that things like neuroticism are strongly related to certain health outcomes like heart disease and cancer-related deaths. We find that things like openness are related to some important outcomes you'd expect to be related to those things. So, for example, people high on states high on openness, they tend to have more people going to museums than others. They tend to have more patents taken out. Some of the other work we've done with Martin Obszonka and his colleagues have been looking at the personality profile associated with entrepreneurship. So there's a long history looking at the personality profile of entrepreneurs. And what we have done in that research is we have linked the personality of people in certain states, and we've replicated this across the US, Germany, and the UK, and we find, and these are completely separate samples, we find that in states or counties, etc., with people with entrepreneurial profiles, you see various indicators of high entrepreneurial activity. So this is really quite interesting because just as the past work in psychology has informed microeconomic analyses, so much of the work that, for example, Daniel Kahneman has been doing, it shows that we can also take this macro-psychological perspective, looking at the psychology of broad regions to understand macroeconomic behaviors at a large scale. Now, of course, you have to always be careful of making the ecological fallacy. It's quite possible that you could find a group-level effect and it not be true at the individual level. But these analyses are totally new in shedding light on a possibly previously unstudied area of factors that might influence large-scale economic behavior. I mean, I think there are a number of ways that personality is going to influence our humans' interactions with robots and other mechanical devices. And that is the nature of our interactions is very much affected by the personality of those other individuals, whether that individual is another human, another robot, or perhaps, as some of my other research shows, another type of animal, dogs. People are very much interested in the personality of dogs when they select a dog, because that affects the nature of their interaction. Some dogs are better lap dogs, some dogs are better at going on exercising and so on. So just as we may choose a dog or a romantic partner or a co-worker and so on the basis of personality, it's very likely that we'll also make those kinds of deliberations when choosing a robot. Now, of course, what's interesting here is that robots aren't subject to the same biological constraints that humans and other dogs are. And we may be able to design the robot to match our personality. So it seems quite likely that we'll be able to do that. What was particularly interesting was when we were doing our research in office spaces and going around looking at how people had organized their spaces. So, and I'm thinking here of a lot of the cubicles where there's no real space in the cubicles for people to express themselves, yet people are balancing various trinkets and signs and symbols on the top of their computers, along the edges of the cubicles and various other places. And what this shows is the need that people have to express who they are, to express their identity. And I think that once designers of offices become familiar with this work and this need, they need to take this into account. And I think this has implications for some of the trends in office designing. So there's a lot of talk now about hot desking, where people come in and they just take whatever desk is available and they do their work there. Sure, that may be quite efficient in getting people to do work and not take up much space, but in a sense it neglects a very important psychological function that these spaces serve, which is telling other people about who they are and conveying that to them. The other research that is really interesting to me is the stuff I'm doing with architect Chris Travis. And in that work, we are really using psychology to try to understand the sorts of spaces that make people feel happy, they feel safe, feel protected. People will often tell you about the sorts of space they need, and they'll often have pretty firm ideas about the spaces that will make them happy. But I think in general, they're pretty clueless about those things. So I think by trying to expand architects' awareness of the importance between the connections in space, we can really integrate these ideas into building spaces. One of the things that has always been puzzling to me is that if you look at the syllabi of top architecture programs, they allow some students to take psychology, but they don't require it, and that seems to me totally baffling. Why would people building spaces for humans not think it's important to learn something important about humans, about their psychology? We know that's important. Other connections is, for example, the work that you're doing, looking at trying to match people with the right spaces. So I think that's fascinating. This idea of saying, if people use their personality to select their homes, then one way of finding out whether that home is suitable to me is, are the people who've lived there before similar to me? If so, that's an initial sign that maybe this will be a good fit. So I think really though that the key is just beginning to understand that when we think about spaces, moving away from this purely functional perspective, that does it allow me to do things efficiently from a functional perspective, to looking at the psychological perspective too. That's I think, enormously important, but much neglected. I think the work that Mikhail Kaczynski is doing on Facebook Likes, where he is linking the things people like to their personalities, is really doing the same thing as our work is doing, but just in a different domain. He is finding out whether people like certain activities, whether they like certain sorts of music, whether they like certain icons. So I think the interesting thing about this is that it's really, the likes has allowed people to connect directly to the things and with great detail and fidelity paint a portrait of the things they like. The one difference may be that people are unlikely to like things that they kind of secretly like or don't want to convey to others, and that's where going into people's spaces is helpful. You can see things if you look in their private spaces that are not obvious on something like Facebook. Of course,
could you give
it's
an
much
example
more
there?
difficult to get in access to people's private spaces than is their Facebook profiles. Yeah, I mean, examples of things that people may like in private but not in public. Maybe, for example, they put the highbrow books out in the living room for people to see, but the trashy novels in their bedroom, which are the ones they really read. And the equivalent would be they would only perhaps like Goethe and Shakespeare and so on, and not openly like Jilly Cooper or whoever it is.
Yeah. Okay.